All right, guys, welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here, we're doing our 2024 preview and prediction for the Michigan State Spartans. New look coaching staff. Johnathan Smith, 34-35 record over 6 seasons at Oregon State. Doesn't tell the full story, as over the last 2 to 3 years, he's really developed them into a team that can compete for a near 6 bowl bid. Brian Lindgren, he was at Oregon State since 2018 as the OC. Joe Rossi, he's been a successful defensive coordinator for Minnesota since 2017. He brings him over, and most of his staff arrives from Corvallis as well. And obviously the biggest headline here, Nick, back-to-back losing seasons before they could even punch that record in for last year. Mel Tucker was gone. He was fired in pretty intriguing fashion, and obviously they avoid paying a $79 million buyout. Obviously, I think a lot still has to be handled in terms of legalities when it comes to that, Nick. But it was an interesting hire. He was 2-0. They didn't hesitate one bit. Obviously, there was a harassment, sexual harassment accusation that led to this firing. It was pretty fast, Nick, I would say, and very shocking. And it seems like it was a pretty solid way to get rid of paying a massive buyout.
Mel Tucker's downfall was very swift up there at Michigan State. This team was really solid previously under Tucker. They were 11-2 in 2021, but they regressed heavily in 2022. They were 5-7 and looked absolutely lifeless, and like the program was heading in an absolutely wrong direction. And when you look at that 2023 season, the two teams they beat, Central Michigan and Richmond, but that wasn't really a whole lot of promising future. They had tough games on the schedule coming up. They had a really tough slate of games ahead of them, and it seemed like this team was heading nowhere. That buyout, like you said, $79 million. Then this whole, harassment thing comes up, and it looked pretty credible, very credible to the university, obviously, and it seemed to be a big issue, and obviously it clouded the university in a bad look. So they fired him, cut ties immediately with cause, don't have to pay the $79 million, and now they go and grab a guy in Johnathan Smith who was pretty loyal to Oregon State. That is, it's kind of crazy that he left, considering he played quarterback there in the late 90s, early 2000s, had been a graduate assistant there, and had spent the past couple of seasons there turning this team into a solid team. They were 7-6 in 2021, 10-3 in 2022, including a win in the Las Vegas Bowl, and 8-4 prior to his departure to join the Spartans, who looked to be in a deep rebuild.
Johnathan Smith, I think a big reason for him departing is because Oregon State not in a conference, and I think that definitely led to his departure. Looking at this offense, last year was not very good at all. Look at the numbers on screen. Towards the bottom of college football, and many of them, including points per game, only 15.9. Key losses, they lost the entire quarterback room. Malik Carr was a good tight end, a couple of solid offensive linemen as well. And then, Trey Mosley, of course, one of their top pass catchers, is gone. There's not much coming back for this unit. You look at Nate Carter, a running back who ended up being the leading rusher after a move from UConn. He has good stop-start ability. How will he adjust to a different scheme, though, at 5'10", 200? Kyron Lynch Adams from UMass. This is a very good player. This is a name I recognized from the start when they landed him, an 1,100-yard rusher, dynamic back with some good long speed, has nice vision, seems to run with good urgency as well. Brandon Tullis and Mekhi Frazier, 2 3-star true freshman running backs, will find themselves in the fold. Solid running back room here. I think it's going to be a productive 1-2 punch. Obviously, under Smith, Nick, this was a team that had a power run game that was very successful. Damian Martinez, and of course, Aiden Childs, the guy a lot of people wanted. He was a pretty high-end recruit, true dual threat player, easy release. Torches teams of his legs, very efficient in the option game. Showed the ability to throw on the run as well. I think he has a nice feel for the game overall. Needs to keep adding size. He is up to about 6'3", 213. He wasn't great versus the blitz. Meaningful game experience in year one, didn't have much of it. You also didn't get to see him uncork many deep balls. They tried to get him on the field as much as they could, Nick. The biggest question is, can he be a field general from the pocket in year one? And, how much do you think they'll center around the run game? Not with just Childs' legs, but again, it's probably a solid 1-2 punch.
I like this quarterback room and this running back room with Childs leading the quarterback room. I think they brought in they brought in true freshmen as well as another transfer in Tommy Schuster. I think Childs is a really solid quarterback. Didn't look incredible in the pocket, but I think that's something you can work on. Really solid legs for him, nice movement, bulking up a little bit like you mentioned. Really solid, can throw on the run. Really nice feel for the game. I do think, continue to bulk him up a little bit. He wasn't great against the blitz like you alluded to, but overall I think he's still a really solid quarterback and a good bridge quarterback to start out here, considering this team was horrendous, on offense at all last year. 199 pass yards per game, below 200. They really struggle below 300 yards of total offense per game and 15.9 points per game. So they really can only go up from here. I think Childs is a really solid start. I do like the running back room. I think the ads from the two true freshmen have really nice potential to break out as well. I think Lynch Adams is an incredible ad from UMass, a guy that could really be a nice big starter for this running back room. And I think Nate Carter had a good year last year, right? 800 yards on the ground, 4.3 yards per carry. So not very efficient, but 4 touchdowns for him as well as 22 receptions out of the backfield. So Carter is very versatile. You can move him around, get a lot out of him. I think he's a really solid back to return for this offense.
Yeah, the Lindgren's offense, plenty of I formation, big passing plays often come off of play action. That doesn't just seem to be really what Childs is going to fit, though. So I think you're going to see a lot of variations, a lot of shotgun movement as well. I think a nice balanced approach in terms of scheme will be the expectation. I think that could lead to some good success. Look at the wide receiver room, Mo Foster broke out as expected. Fifth-year man had 73 targets, mainly as an outside wide receiver. They have another fifth-year guy, Alante Brown. He was expected to get on the field and only saw a few touches for the entire year. Kind of a red flag there. Jerron Glover, who had 3 drops last season, figures to crack the lineup as an X. I think the biggest impact is expected to come from true freshman 4-star Nick Marsh. He had a great spring game for 100-plus yards, including a nice catch and run for a touchdown. He has dangerous speed matched with an impressive frame of 6'3", 208. They also have Antonio Gates Jr., had 5 grabs as a redshirt freshman. Solid wide receiver group. I think Marshy's going to see a lot of reps. I don't think it's all that impressive. I think the addition of Jack Vealing from Oregon State, who was a productive player with 8 touchdowns last year, certainly can help boost this room a good bit. He has the speed to win against linebackers, nice long strider, runs good routes, nice willingness as a blocker, 6'5", 246, shows a nice wide base, doesn't have the greatest play strength and needs to get better at attacking zone coverage, but Vealing is an incredibly underrated tight end, Nick, that not a lot of people are going to talk about. I think him and, again, that true freshman and Nick Marsh are going to have for big seasons. The rest of the unit I'm not so sure about.
This is not an incredible unit, not one of the best, but it's not one of the worst either. This is a middle-of-the-road unit that I do think has some nice upside. I think Foster is a really solid returnee for this team in that wide receiver Z-role, top returning pass catcher, 576 yards receiving, 13.4 yards per grab, and 3 scores. Glover, 261 and 18.6 yards per grab for him as well. Nate Carter, like I mentioned during the running back segment, that he can also catch passes. And Antonio Gates, he had 5 catches, including 1 for a touchdown and 82 yards. I think Gates could be a really nice player to break out potentially this year. Nick Marsh, a really high impact freshman that can jump up immediately. Brown, he could potentially step up as well and be involved. And then when you look at the Jack Vealing, he's a really good physical, prototypical tight end that could be really solid for this team. I do think this wide receiving room has some nice upside.
You look at the offensive line. I thought this was a unit that had some pretty solid players, but obviously they're going to go back to square one here. They do return Brandon Baldwin at left tackle. Really struggled last year. He got demolished versus both teams that played in the Natty in Washington and Michigan. Luke Newman was an exceptional player for Holy Cross, the left tackle. Appears to be transferring in to play guard, a position he never played in high school, or since high school, that is. About 6'5", 310. Tanner Miller follows Smith over from Oregon State. He was an exceptional run blocker, but really got melted in pass protection. He appears slotted for starting center, despite most of his reps coming at right guard last year. Kristen Phillips, a guy who pulled his name from the portal, should be in line to start at that right guard position, which is big since they already lost a few likely starters in the portal. Ashton Lepto, Stanton Ramil, both young cats are going to battle for right tackle. Overall, they lose 4 starters, including a few good ones on the interior. And I felt, again, the offensive line would be a bit of a strength for MSU. Pass pro wasn't all that bad. Ground game was pretty awful, though. Jim Mitchell was a good offensive line coach in his tenure with Smith at Oregon State. Really developed them into a physical unit. That's going to take time in East Lansing, Nick. They had a great right tackle in Talise Fuaga. Ended up going very high in the draft. It was a very good unit at Oregon State, but it's going to take time.
It's going to certainly take time to develop. I do think the building blocks are in place. I think Brandon Baldwin has struggled at left tackle, but a nice player to return. Same thing with Phillips and Lepo, 2 guys that you return that are redshirt sophomore that got good, snaps as true freshmen and got some experience, or redshirt freshmen got some experience. And you look at the 2 ads. I think Luke Newman's an incredible ad from Holy Cross, a very underrated ad. Really solid piece of that Holy Cross offensive line that was really solid on the FCS level. Going to kick him into guard. I think he's going to be a big, physical, solid guard there. Tanner Miller as well is really solid at center. A guy that has some good experience at Oregon State, follows his coach over. Really solid slotting him in there. The depth worries me. Not a whole lot of depth on the offensive line here, but I do think the starting 5 is not a bad unit at all.
Verdict for me on this offense, Smith is somewhat considered an offensive guru. Again, he was a quarterback at Oregon State, and he was a pretty good OC in his time as well before going to the Beavers. And this is a unit that was awful last season. I think it's going to improve, but expecting growing pains with limited depth across the board, and offensive line is likely going to step back. It's certainly going to be expected. I think Childs will struggle at times himself in the passing game. I expect a heavy dose of run, but they'll have to be more physical for that to happen. I think this is a solid unit overall. I think they're going to show some creativity, and the talent, I think, is also a little bit better than maybe it was last year in certain areas. Look at the defensive side of the ball. This is a unit that certainly the last 2 years really hasn't been as good as it probably should have been. 28 points per game, lost 11 guys in the portal, but added 12 alongside 6 returning starters. This defensive line, I think, is impressive. The interior returns Maverick Hansen, a fifth-year player at 6'4", 315, whose production has dropped, but still a quality run defender. Lots of transfers make up the rest. A good one in Georgia Tech's Daquan Dose took a bit of a step back last year, but was a really good run stopper in 22. A guy in Ben Roberts only played a couple of snaps at Oregon. The last 2 years, a 6'2", 310. Jalen Satchel, 6'1", 300, played a good bit last year for Old Dominion. Alex Van Summeren, 6'3", 292, played a few snaps in 2022. Nothing since, considering he missed all of last year. And they've did a pretty good job of beefing up the depth, and considering they lost Derek Harmon and Simeon Barrow. It's pretty massive, though. And, the staff was hopeful that Chris Bogle can really emerge this year. 6'5", 244-pound defensive end who has good physical tools, but has battled injuries and, has bounced around the depth chart a good bit. Quindarius Dunning from Middle Tennessee had 8 pass breakups along with 10 tackles for loss. He's going to be a starter, an immediate upgrade up front against the run. I think Jalen Thompson's a player they're really keying in on. He was really impressive as a true freshman. They definitely think he can take a major leap this fall. Solid bunch on the D-line. Run D was never really abysmal, but they certainly need a better production and consistency, Nick. And again, if the loss of Harmon and Barrow, it's going to be incredibly difficult.
Some decent players here, a lot of big shoes to fill, but solid players. I think Maverick Hansen's a solid player, 21 total tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks for him. Jalen Thompson, 19 total tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks plus 2 pass breakups. Solid numbers there. Chris Bogle, 14 total tackles plus 2 tackles for loss and 1.5 sacks for him. You highlighted some solid ads out of the portal. Some guys, I think Daquan Dowse could be solid from Georgia Tech. I think he's a really good run stopper who could plug in. Ben Roberts has potential to be involved as well. Jalen Satchel, a decent ad from Old Dominion, like the size on him. I think this is a defensive line that's not a bad unit. They return some solid pieces as well as add some from depth from the portal. I think they'll take a step back from last year, but I think still a formidable unit.
Look in the middle of this defense, which is likely to be a 4-2-5. They added Wayne Matthews, who was an elite player for Old Dominion. 135 tackles, which actually had him second on the team. That's crazy, right? 9.5 tackles for loss as well. Did good in coverage. I think this is a very good addition for them. Jordan Turner started the last 2 seasons at Wisconsin. He was third on the team in tackles last fall. Quality run stopper, a certain upgrade here, I think. Cal Holiday is back. He's played 2,300 snaps over 3 years for them. Has been a massive liability in coverage, but has been the team's leading tackler for 3 consecutive years. I mean, his role is pretty much solidified. I think Darius Snow, he's only been able to play 5 games over the last 2 seasons, but the ex-safety is still expected to contribute in the middle. I think the linebacking group remains the best unit on this defense, and probably the entire team. They also have Jordan Hall, who played a good bit as a true freshman. He should also boom. I don't think there's any concerns right here in the middle of the defense, Nick. Just playing with more consistency and Cal Holiday not being as bad in coverage are the real issues here.
I do like this linebacking unit. Holiday has to figure out his coverage woes. 91 total tackles, top returning tackler, returning 5.5 tackles for loss, plus a pick for him. Hall looked really good as a true freshman. Moving in the slot, you moving around in that linebacking room. 67 total tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. Top returning tackler or sack getter and tackle for loss numbers there. I also think that you return Darius Snow if he can stay healthy. He's a solid player. He had 6 tackles in his limited appearances, plus the 2 ads from the portal are solid. Wayne Matthews, 135 tackles and 9.5 tackles for loss at Old Dominion. Really solid numbers for him. I love a stat sheet stuffer like that. I think he's a really solid ad there.
Looking in the secondary, Jaden Mangnum really stepped up before INTs last year after the entire team only had 2 in 2022. Amarian Smith coming back from injury is nice. Dylan Tatum was pretty respectable as a run stopper at the cornerback position last year. He's going to move to safety now. Angelo Gross should contend for a starting spot after being around for numerous seasons, being one of the better assets last year. Chance Rucker, he's penciled in as a starting corner. He was a pretty horrid tackler, but another true freshman last year that was forced on the action and played pretty well. They're going to have Ed Woods, a 5th-year player. It's quite promising for Arizona State last fall, hoping to establish a formidable corner duo with him on the other side of Rutger. Wajan Cavazos, now in his 3rd team, he hasn't really been good, while Malik Spencer should be a full-time slot player for them. The pass defense has certainly improved, but the better offense has absolutely dominated them, as ranked opponents average nearly 350 yards per game on 70% completion rating. They'll improve slightly, but the notion can be only repaired with a revamp in talent, Nick. I remember back in 2021, going into that Ohio State game, I was like, man, these guys are going to get flatlined in the secondary. They ended up giving up 450 yards and 6 touchdowns to the Buckeyes that day, all of which pretty much came in the first half. They got absolutely bombed, Nick. And the same thing happened in 2023. They saw Michael Penix 536 and 4 touchdowns in another blowout loss. The secondary is just not good. It never was under Mel Tucker, which is crazy to think that he couldn't get these guys in line. Nothing worked, Nick. The guys they have, the transfers they brought in, even some guys from Georgia like Amir Speed, weren't any good. This is going to take time here.
Certainly Joe Rossi has his work cut out for him in terms of building a secondary. This unit has just been horrendous. Like you laid off the stats there, 237.8 pass yards per game. There are some solid players here, a couple of decent guys here and there, but this is a very bad unit. Malik Spencer, 72 total tackles, 6 pass breakups for him. Dylan Tatum, a nice guy that they return as well. A guy that plays free safety, 45 total tackles, 7 pass breakups for him. And then Chance Rucker, 4 pass breakups and a pick, 23 total tackles as a true freshman. But this unit has been horrendous. They really have to step up. They need to figure out a way to, be better in coverage, be better in general on the secondary side of the ball, because they just continue to get torched by these better passing offenses. And they're going to see some of those tougher passing offenses in the schedule, which we're going to get to in a minute, which is a really tough look for this team because they're going to get absolutely torched again.
Well, I don't think I mentioned Jaden Magnum actually transferred to Michigan. I was, pointing out how he was a big playmaker for them last year, stepping up, and obviously he moves out. That's a note that needs to be added where, their best player is now gone to the rivals, so certainly not great things there. For Decatur on this side of the ball, the defense wasn't awful. They showcased the ability to compete at times versus similar style of teams, but had flat-out no answer versus the tougher competition. It was an easy cakewalk for most opponents. Joe Rossi, though, arrives after accomplishing a good bit despite weak overall talent at Minnesota. Defensive line has some intrigue, respectable transfers, while the linebacking group is stout. But again, this secondary likely won't have many meaningful improvements. Leading us to the final prediction, Spartans landed a good, unexpected hire following a horrid ending to what was a promising start to Mel Tucker's time. Smith brings over a good staff to develop long-term. And with better resources here in East Lansing, I think Michigan State can get back on track to sustainable success. In terms of 2024, though, I think this defense can show some solid improvements, while Childs will spend this season really trying to evolve into a star around what's mainly a subpar supporting cast that does have a few good assets, but a woeful offensive line might be the demise for them. I think Johnathan Smith's a pretty good coach, Nick. Obviously, things did not start very well at Oregon State. This is a guy that went 2-10 in his first season. And it took him, 4 years before he hit a bowl game. But once he did that, they were competing at a pretty high level. I don't think they're going to be able to accomplish much this year. 4 wins for the both of us. And I definitely think this is a weird conference where they'll probably maybe win a game like Maryland, Illinois, Rutgers, games we have them losing. They'll probably be able to flip those because this is just what happens in this conference, especially the home games. For me, though, I'm going to stick with 4-8. Do have them beating Indiana and Purdue late in the year. But I think this is going to be a tough challenge overall. I think long-term, this will be a team that can compete for 8+ wins a year.
I think it's going to be a team that can compete in the future. I think, Smith was the right hire here. I think he's a guy that's a really solid coach that turned around a pretty poor Beavers program out there. And certainly, the instability of them without a conference and a lot of question marks with the future of that program led to him, jumping ship and heading to what isn't really an incredible job opportunity, in my opinion, because this is going to be a long rebuild. It's going to take some time, but once he figures it out, I think this team will be solid. I do like some of the portal ads. I think the wide receiving room is very underrated and not enough people are giving love to that room. I think the linebacking core is a solid unit top to bottom. I think the offensive line has some upside as well. Plus, I like some of the running backs they plug in there with Childs. So I think this is a team that is interesting to watch. If you got nothing going on a Saturday, your team's already finished playing, I think you should tune in and check out a Spartans game this year. I think they are worth watching just to see what they kind of develop and turn into. I have them at 4-8. The schedule is tough, some tough road trips in there. At Boston College is a very interesting game in terms of the non-conference. What are the Eagles going to look like when we get to them later in the preview cycle? Looking at teams, I do think there's some tough road games at Illinois, at Michigan, at Oregon as well, plus Maryland in their very tough home and away draw. I think this is a team to keep an eye on in the future. I don't think they're going to be contending next year either, but I think 2-3 years down the line, this is a team you can look at in the Big Ten and say, hey, they can get to 10 wins potentially with the roster that they're building with Johnathan Smith in charge.
I think the biggest thing you want to see with this team is this 4-game stretch. Ohio State, Oregon, Iowa, Michigan, 2 of them coming on the road. You just want to see what kind of muscle they can flex, Nick, in terms of just not giving up on their team. That's going to be the biggest thing here in year 1, is just seeing how they can manage getting absolutely blasted, I think, 4 games in a row. And obviously, we have them turning around and winning, after that 4-game stretch. But it's going to be very hard for that to happen. I think this team's going to be incredibly demoralized, and they're going to be punched in the gut, Nick. So I think that 4-game stretch is really going to define this first season here in Smith's tenure.
Certainly a tough stretch there when you look at it. At Michigan, at Oregon are very unforgiving. Ohio State, even at home, is a very unforgiving matchup as well. Tough draws, certainly, but I think this team will have to learn and build from this, right? You might lose by a whole amount of points, but if you lose with pride, you lose playing hard. If you keep it close early on, that could certainly go a long way in developing this team for the future.
be it for today's episode. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.